Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra Ayin Zayin Bava Basra 77. The daf yomi is dedicated for Shmira for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shvuyim, Yeshua for Am Yisrael on this Eis Tzara. We're going to start on 76b, 7 lines from the bottom. It says the Gemara, Amar Papa Hayman Demazmal Ishtari L'Chavri. Somebody wants to sell a note to his friend, a contract. Let's say Reuben has a note that Shimon owes him $1,000, and he wants to sell this IOU to Levi. So Hayman the Mazmul Ishtar Chavre Tzarach Chamichta way. When Reuben gives it to Levi, he needs to write Kanihu. You're acquiring the note. V'kol Shibuda Tebei, and any of the liens that are on it. Meaning to say, you acquire this lien. Amar Vashi Amritza Lishmai. So it means to say, if you don't write a contract on the contract, then you haven't transferred the value of the contract. Amar Vashi Amritza Lishmaita Kamed Rav Kahana V'Amri Sli. And so Rav Ashi says, I said this in front of Rav Kahana, and I said to him, time of the cost of Leihachi, he has to actually write this. A low cost of Leihachi Lo Kani, but if he doesn't write this, Kani Lai Kani Hu V'Kol Shibudei. Well, Kani hasn't acquired it, so he just does the mitzvah. He just hands it over. What does he hand it over? What's he going to use the piece of paper if it doesn't have the value of the note? Is he just using it as like a bottle cap? So, is that what he needs it for? Donna said to me, yeah, if he doesn't, it says Rav Ashi, Rav Kana said to me, if he doesn't write a note saying that this is write a contract saying that this is to acquire it and all the value of it, then it's just, the value is just a bottle cap. So Amar Meimer Hilchasa, so Meimer says, we're going to paskin in this matter like Rebbe. Hilchasa Osios nicknames b'Masira Rebbe. He rules like Rebbe that you don't need to write it, not like Rav Papa said, not like Rav Kahana ruled, but rather the whole osios, the letters, are acquired through Masira, through being handed over. You don't need to have a contract for the contract. That's the position of Rebbe, and that's the position that Amemar says the halacha is like. So Amalei Rav Ashi Amemar, so Rav Ashi says to Amemar, this idea that the law is that a contract can be acquired just by handing it over, you don't need another contract to write it down. Is this Gemara or Svara? Here the word Gemara means tradition. Every day we do Gemara. What does the word Gemara mean? Here we see that the word Gemara means tradition. Is it Gemara? You have a tradition that the law is that osios, the contract, could be acquired just by being handed over from one person to another. Or is it a logical assumption? Normally Gemara. So Rav Ashi said, Amemar said to Rav Ashi, it's a tradition. We have a tradition that this is the ruling. Amar Vashi Svar Namihu. It's also logical. It's also logical to say that you acquire the contract just by handing over and not through another contract. Why? Osios milininu, because osios, letters, they're words. So a contract's not going to help because words don't acquire other words. You need an action to acquire the other word. And so therefore it's logical to assume you should not require a contract to hand over the value of the contract. Rather, you just need to do an action of handing it over, which is what we call Masira. Gemara says, Vilo, is it really the case that words cannot acquire words? We're going to introduce several laws here. The question is not completely clear, but we'll explain it the way the Rashbam explains it. So the question is going to take us all the way until 77b. Again, Gemara's assumption here is that words cannot acquire other words, and you need an action to acquire the value of the contract. So Gemara says, is it really the case that words cannot acquire other words? But Amar Rav Bar Yitzchak, Amar Rav Shnei Shtarosim. There are two laws about contracts that are different from each other. What the first law is Zachu b'sadeh, or if he says to Reuben says to two witnesses, or to two people who are with him, Zachu b'sadeh. He says, listen, guys, I want you to acquire this field. I want to give this field to Shimon, and you guys accept on his behalf. Shimon's not here. And then the kisvulo as a star, and also write him a contract that I gave it to him that I handed over the property to Shimon. So Choser b'shtar v'eno choser b'sada. So the first law that Rabbi Yitzchak says in the name of Rav is he could go back on the contract because with the respect to writing a contract, he was appointing these people to be his agents. So he could cancel their shlichus, he could cancel their agency. But he can't go back on the gift because those people had acquired it. And they're working, the two people are working on behalf of Shimon. They acquired it on behalf of Shimon. Once Shimon acquires it, Reuben can't renege on that. So therefore, he can go back on the contract and he cannot go back on the field. So that's the first law. The second law is if he says to these two people, Reuben says, acquire this field on behalf of Shimon on the condition that you write him a contract. Well, then then if he goes back on the contract and he tells them not to write a contract anymore, then he's also reneged on the deal and he can't do it because they haven't acquired it until they wrote the contract. They haven't acquired it for Shimon yet. So then the Rebbe Chia bar Abin says, Amarav Huna Shlosha Shtarosein. So now Rav Chia bar Abba comes along and says, I have three laws. Still haven't asked the question yet. So he says, I have three laws about contracts. Train Hadam. And the first two is that which we said. And Idach, what's the third one? In Kadam Mocher, the third one is, let's say the seller comes along because of Esashtar. The seller comes along and he's intending to sell this property to another person, but he's worried because he needs money. He's worried the guy when time comes for the sale, he knows he's selling to this person, the scribe is not going to be there. So therefore, he has a scribe in his presence and he writes it down. So he'll have the contract ready for the purchaser as right when he's ready to sell. So therefore, in Kadam Mocher V'Kosav Esashtar, let's say the seller comes along and writes the document in advance, like that which we learned, Kosvin Shtar L'Mocher, you're able to write a contract for the seller, even though the purchaser is not with him. He's allowed to write it in advance because he's bearing all the risk. So if he's hurting somebody, he's only hurting himself. Once, so Reuben is writing the contract in advance for Shimon, and then Shimon, he doesn't give the contract yet to Shimon, but what does he do? He gives him, Shimon comes along and does a proprietary act on the real estate. Nikna shtar b'kol makom shu. Then the contract is also acquired. V'zui sheshaninu. So how is the contract acquired? So the assumption has to be that the assumption of the Gemara is that how is he acquiring the contract? Because when he gives him the real estate, he's speaking over about the contract, and so therefore he's acquiring the contract with his oral words. And if he's acquiring it with his oral words, then for sure he could acquire with a contract with a written contract. Look at Rashbam. Rashbam says because that the contract is acquired just with words. He wants the seller wants to give it to the purchaser. Even though the purchaser hasn't picked up the contract with his physical hands, he still acquired it. And kol shekain, and for sure the case earlier, the shtar b'shtar mikne, that a contract can be acquired with another contract. Even here, with just words, in this case, he's acquired even without a contract. For sure, in the case, for sure, he will be able to acquire a contract that's written down. So therefore, this challenges the previous case. And the Gemara now just finishing its statement. And this is how we learned the movable property, i.e., the contract, can be acquired with the real estate, with a contract with real estate with money. So the Gemara, just to review the question, the Gemara had said that perhaps Masira is the only way to hand over the value of the contract because that's the law, because the contract is words, and you can't say you need a contract to acquire a contract because words can't acquire words. And Gemara says, well, what about this case where it seems that the value of the contract is handed over and all he's doing is speaking about the contract at the time where the person is collecting the real estate. So the Gemara says, no, this case is completely different. This is the way this contract is acquired is not just with words, but through what's called agav. An agav is shani. It's acquired by dint of the fact that you have real estate. Then you're able to transfer with the sale of the real estate. Once he takes possession of the real estate, he's able to transfer other items. And so therefore, that's how this contract is being handed over. By dint of the transfer of the real estate, the contract is being handed over as well. Because we know that by a coin, it's going to be a sugya in Hazav, that a coin is not acquired through a kinyan chalipin. You can't exchange something. Remember, we did this. The agav ara nikni, but a coin can be acquired by dint of the property. If you acquire property and you can acquire gold in association with that. Agav ara nikni. Ki hadar papa havale tracer alpha zuz. Papa had 12,000 zuz sitting in Bechuzai. And he didn't want to go all the way to Bechuzai to get the money that they owed him, but he couldn't send an agent because they said, we're not going to give it to the agent because we're responsible until the agent returns to you. So what did Rav Papa do? Rav Papa wanted to transfer the money, his share in the money, to the agent himself. And how did he do it? And then they could give it to the agent because it's the agent's money. So how did Rav Papa do it? So he gave it to Rav Shmuel Bar Acha. But how did Rav Shmuel Bar Acha pick up the money? The money's in Bechuzai. So how did Rav Papa give it to him? Through the threshold of the house. Meaning he gave him the threshold of the house, and he said, along with this, I've given you the 12,000 zuz. And then when you come back, you'll give me back my 12,000. You'll give me back the 12,000 zuz that I gave you as a deposit. When Rav Shmuel Bar Acha came back, Rav Papa went all the way out to Tavach to greet him. He was so happy with this arrangement. And we learned back in Mishnah that if you sell a boat, you have not sold the avodim, the martzufin v'os antiki. So what's an antiki? Rav Papa iska de begava. This is the merchandise that's on the boat. Now up to the next Mishnah. Machar es hakaron or machar es haprados. Now, let's say you sold a wagon. You have not sold the mules associated with the wagon. Machar es haprados. If you sold the mules, or machar es hakaron. You have not sold the wagon. Machar es hatzemed or machar es habakar. If you sold the cattle, you have not sold the yoke. Machar es habakar or machar es hatzemed. If you sold the yoke, you have not sold the cattle. If you sold the cattle, you have not sold the yoke. Rabbi Huda says, Hadamim Modim. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, no, we can learn out from the money what you intended. If a yoke cost $2 and the cattle cost $200 and you paid $200, you clearly just did not intend to buy the yoke. You intended to buy also the oxen. Kate said, Amar Machar, well, Machar Simdech. He said, sell me your yoke for Masayim Zuz for 200 Zuz. Hadavar Yadua Sheinat Semed ben Masayim Zuz. The matter is known that the yoke is not 200 zuz, so clearly you're intending to buy the oxen. The Chum say the money is not a proof to this matter. Tani Rav Tachlife bar Marava kamed Rabbi Avo. So Rav Tachlife bar Marava, Rav Tachlife, he was a bar Marava. Doesn't mean he was the son of the Marava. It means he was a person of Eretz Yisrael. Ma'arav is the west. From Babylon, it's the west of Babylon. So he says, Rav Tachlifi bar Marava taught in front of Rav Avo, Macharas Hakaron, Macharas Haprados. Our Mishnah says if you sold the wagon, you have not sold the mules. But he taught this, so he said if you sold the wagon, you sold the mules. Vanan, lo machar tanan, but didn't we say you have not sold it? So how can we say you sold it? So Amrway. So when Rav Tachlifa taught this in front of Rav Avo, and Rav Avo corrected him, Rav Tachlifa said, Ismaya, should I delete this Braisa from my collection of sources? I'm really low, don't delete it. Titargim, explain it, or Masnis Eich Va'adukimbo. Your Braisa, when it says if you sold a wagon, you sold the mules, that's where they're attached. And we'll see more about this on Daf Memches. When the mules are attached, then they're sold along with the wagon. It says if you sold a yoke, you have not sold the cattle. It says the Gemara, Hechidami, what are we referring to? Ilema dekaro et simda, or bakar. Or if you want to say we're talking about a case where it's a place where they call the yoke, and the cattle, the cattle. Pshita, obviously it's the case. If you say I'm selling you a yoke, you haven't sold the cattle. That's obviously the case. So obviously he sold them the yoke, but not the cattle. Well, but if it's a place where he also called the cattle the yoke, then obviously it's the case that then if he says I'm selling you the yoke and yoke also refers to cattle, well then everything would be included in it. So what's the case of our Mishnah? That why does our Mishnah need to say if you sell the yoke, you have not sold the cattle? Simda, or bakar. No, we're talking about a case where you call the simda the yoke, and the cattle. And the economy, the karo bakar simda. But there are some people who also call the cattle the yoke. And so since there's some overlap, they have to be clarified. And so therefore we have, as Rashbam says, Hashta Mesafko and Bahai Gavra Mehai Minayahu. Therefore, we have this concern about this man, which one he intended to sell. Did he call the bakar the tzemet or not? So the Gemara says, well, about that, Rabbi Yehuda Savar Adam and Modin. In that scenario, Rabbi Yehuda says, well, we look how much money you spent. Because Rabbi Yehuda says, if the money will tell us if he's one of the people who purchased a yoke, meaning to say, did he pay the 200 zuz? It's clear he intended also to buy the ox as well. Rabbanan Savri ain't Adam and Modian. Ain't Adam and Raya. The Rabbanan say, no, the amount of money you paid is not going to be proof. So Rashbam explains, Komar Nehi Nami de Ain't Adam and Raya. He says, granted, the money is not a proof. Machar said Semed Machar Sabakar. The mashma of Semed Machor. Meaning to say, if he sold the cattle, the yoke has not sold the cattle, but that implied that the yoke itself was sold. And the Gemara is going to ask the question, why? I don't understand why it would be a valid sale for the yoke. If you paid 200 zuz and we say, okay, you said for the yoke and you didn't buy the cattle, according to Rabbanan, you don't get the cattle, but why is the sale of the yoke still standing? As Rashbam explains, they have a bittul mekach. The sale was way above the 1.6 price, so it should be canceled. We should cancel the sale, return his money, and take back his yoke. And Rashbam explains this is like the law of Onah that we learned in Parakazav and Bava Mitzia, Memtesim Beis, Kedin Kol Onah. Any price fraud, Yoser Mishtus, that's greater than 1.6, is Debato Amakach. Meaning to say the sale is canceled. If it's less than a 6, we learned in Bava Mitzia that the sale is that it's mochel. The purchaser waives it, or the seller waives it if it's less than a 6th distinction. If it's an actual 6th, we say the sale stands, but he has to return the overcharge. And if it's more than a 6th, the sale is canceled. So according to the Rabbanan who say that the Ein Adam Raya, that the amount of money is not a proof, if he paid for a cattle and he only got the yoke, the sale should be canceled. The Ein Adam Raya, we have a bittul mekach, the sale should be canceled. Says the Gemara, V'chitema bittul mekach or Rabbanan Reisel, who are on top of 78a. You want to say, well, they say the Rabbanan don't hold like bittul mekach. They don't agree with this sugya and azav, meaning to say, they say that even if it's more than a 6, they have to just return the overcharge, but the sale still stands. Vatanan, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, but we learned in the Mishnah in Azav, Rabbi Yehuda says the mocher sefer Torah behema margus. Let's he sold a Torah scroll or an animal or some jewels. Then we say ein lahenonah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there is no one there. And Amar lo lo Amar elas elu. And the Rabbanan said, no. When do we say there's no? Oh no! Only in the case that is listed in the first clause of our Mishnah. Avadim shtaros and karkos by slaves, contracts, and real estate. But in all other cases, there is onah. So we know that the Rabbanan do say bittul mekach. So what would we say over here? So the Gemara gives 2 answers. Ella So we say my ain dam. And what does it mean when we say that that the Rabbanan say that the damim does not prove it? My ain damim. So what does it mean? Raya nami de katani. What does it mean when it says that the money is not a proof? David bito mekach, meaning to say the Chachamim are not saying that the sale is a valid sale, but since the money is not a proof, then he can't ask for the cattle, but the sale is canceled because he paid more than a sixth. Einachinami, the sale will be canceled under those circumstances. The same or alternative answer, ki amar rabbanon ono bitol mekach. When did the Rabbanan say, and this is the answer, which is just a tremendous chiddush, when do we say that there's ona, that there's price fraud and the sale is canceled? B'chtei shadas toa, that if it's within the spectrum of a mistake. But if it's such a large overcharge that nobody would even make some mistake, like if the yoke costs $2 and you pay $200, then we're not going to say that the sale is canceled. Then amor matana yavle, because then we could assume that the guy who gave him the $200 for the yoke, we assume that he's giving it to him as a gift, and so therefore the sale is not canceled. So that's the chiddush of our Gemara, that if the overcharge is so extreme, then we assume it's not an overcharge, but a gift. So this, we'll keep going now, but we'll stop the recording.